Perfect. I froze when my phone buzzed at 2 a.m. and my grandson texted 3 words: pretend you're sick. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 68 years old, and for the last 6 years, my own house felt less like my home and more like a hotel with me as the unpaid staff. I cleaned, cooked, watched the children, and kept quiet while my daughter-in-law rearranged my life and my savings. For years, I swallowed small humiliations until that night when a late message from Ethan made me finally move. I decided I would not play the role they expected. I would leave, but I would not leave empty-handed. I had documented things they thought private. I had bank statements, emails, and receipts that told another story. Would you walk out and expose the people who had treated you like an invisible servant? Or would you go back to being thankful for crumbs of attention? It was 2 in the morning in my kitchen, the light over the table humming, and I remember listening to the refrigerator like it was the only witness. Now, start where the plan began, with a small, harmless text and a stolen hour before sunrise. At first, the disrespect was micro, and it built like mold, spreading into every corner of my life. I remember the smell of overcooked coffee in the mornings, the clacking of the dishwasher at midnight, the thud of the stroller through the hallway as Rachel walked past my bedroom without saying good morning. The texture of that routine was rough, like sandpaper against dignity. They called me helpful, then entitled, then old-fashioned, never stopping to ask if I had money worries or a back that ached from lifting laundry. Mark, my son, would laugh and say everything was fine. Rachel, tall and precise, would thank me with a look that meant, when you retire, you will exist only to fold towels. Jenna, Mark's sister, would visit and pat my shoulder and then suggest I stop being so dramatic. Louise, from next door, used to bring over lemon cake and tell me to smile more. I learned to measure my days by the sound of my grandson Ethan's small footsteps. The taste of the lemon cake was thin, too sweet, glossed like apologies that never stuck. I had a backstory that explained why I stayed. I grew up in a small town, daughter of a woman who taught me that loyalty is currency. I married young, worked odd jobs, saved the pennies that later paid for my son's college and the roof over our heads. I had once trusted people who promised forever and had been taught that leaving was weakness. After my husband died, my home became my anchor, and my habit became to forgive to keep peace. Those habits turned into chains when Rachel arrived. I was responsible for grandchildren because I loved them, but the love was weaponized into labor. My bank account, built from decades of thrift, was slowly accessed for school trips and repairs without discussion. The first time I noticed was a small withdrawal for a repair I did not authorize. The second time, the pattern was clear. I did not know how to be both mother and accountant, both caregiver and litigator, until the night Ethan texted me at 2 in the morning. The first big scene that pushed me to action happened when Rachel announced that she and Mark expected 20 people for a Sunday dinner at my house, all of whom would arrive at midday and stay all evening. I remember the smell of wet coats in the hallway, the chime of the oven, the hush in the kitchen as she said it like an order. I looked at Rachel and said quietly that I would not host that many people. She smiled as if I had made a joke. The living room light made her face porcelain and cold. Dialogue that afternoon between us lasted longer than most conversations we had shared in 5 years. I said, "Why would you assume I can do this alone?" Rachel asked. "We will help," Mark said, but he did not lift a finger. Ethan sent me a text later that night that changed everything. The text felt like a soft shove. His words were small and precise, yet they were a key. He wrote, "Pretend you're sick and get out of there." I wrote back, "What do you mean?" He sent a series of heart emojis and said, "Just go." The air in the kitchen tasted metallic. and I could hear the clock tick as if it were a metronome counting down to a decision. I decided that leaving required more than walking out the front door. The plan was to preserve my dignity and protect what was mine. I sat at the table under that humming light and made a list. First, change passwords and move small sums to a new account I alone controlled. Second, call a lawyer for advice to protect my assets and document what had been taken. Third, hire a private investigator for a single discrete sweep of recent transactions and messages so I could hold facts, not feelings. I remembered the tactile pleasure of opening a safe box years ago and the smell of old paper. I wrote dates and names on a legal pad with a blue pen, every stroke deliberate. I told myself I would not tell anyone unnecessary and that my exit would be logical and quiet. The whole house smelled of lemon cleaner and cold wind through the door. I felt the cotton of my sweater cling to my skin, an oddly comforting friction. The investigation began with a phone call to an attorney named Avery Cole. Avery's voice was calm, like a practiced tide, and precise like a ledger. He asked me to gather bank statements, emails, any texts, and to note transfers. I hired Gina Park, a private investigator who walked into my kitchen with a notebook and a steady look. Gina smelled faintly of jasmine and oil, and when she sat, she pressed her palms into her knees, as if preparing to lift a weight. She listened as I talked about specific transactions. She asked about dates, amounts, who had access to my cards. We found odd ATM withdrawals, school fee payments that bore Rachel's initials, and a recurring charge for a gym membership I never used that was paid from my account. Each piece was a small cut, but together they drew a map. I remember the click of the laptop keys, the faint buzz of my phone, the metallic smell of the kitchen sink drain. Gina printed pages, and Avery explained in plain terms how to preserve evidence and how to approach family conversations legally if necessary. With proof in hand, I executed the plan. I opened a new account at a branch 2 towns over. The bell at the bank had a tinny sound. The tellers were efficient, and the paper smelled faintly of ink. I called Rachel, pretending to be weak, and said I was considering going to a clinic for a week because I felt under the weather. The idea was simple: use absence to create a space where their plans collapsed. Meanwhile, I sent an anonymous package of printed bank statements and a cover letter to Rachel's sister Jenna and to Mark's employer, with highlighted entries and a note asking them to check numbers. I emailed Avery to ready a letter to the family lawyer if things escalated. I texted Ethan and told him I trusted him. The keyboard felt cool under my fingertips, and each sent message left a small electric sting of fear and hope. Panic set into their plans in small, cinematic ways. The grocery list Rachel had pinned to the fridge suddenly grew more frantic. She called me 12 times in one morning. Mark texted from work in caps asking where I had put the cranberry sauce. Jenna arrived with a suitcase and said we could move the party to a hotel, as if displacement would solve the dishonesty. Louis, my neighbor, knocked at my door with a bag of oranges and a face that asked, "What is happening?" The house buzzed with muffled phone calls and the clinking of takeout boxes being ordered last minute. They scrambled to reassign cooks and to bribe friends into helping. The sound of the stroller wheels across the hardwood floors became a drumbeat of anxiety. The smell of burned toast one frantic morning from a pan left on the stove underlined their haste. The texture of the invitations hastily printed on cheap paper revealed their hurry. They were unprepared for absence to be a weapon. They had counted on my constant availability. Then came the confrontation that I had rehearsed quietly for weeks. The day the family arrived, I walked in with a small bag, a face that looked pale and exhausted, and a folder of copies in the crook of my arm. The living room smelled of perfume and hot coffee, the air thick with gossip and laughter that landed like pebbles on calm water. I asked everyone to sit and asked Mark to bring a chair for my lawyer. I remember the sound of chairs scraping, the click of a pen, the rustle of the folder's paper. Avery arrived and placed a crisp envelope on the coffee table. Rachel's eyes sharpened into accusation. The dialogue that followed was long and public. I spoke slowly. I called names and dates. Mark denied. Jenna blinked with surprise. Lewis kept his hands folded, and Ethan watched from the doorway with a small, guilty look. The room tasted like copper. I read aloud a list of transfers, and those who interrupted were answered with evidence. The conversation went back and forth, 8 exchanges that felt like rounds in a long match. I said, "You withdrew funds for school trips without permission." And Rachel answered, "Those were for the children." I said, "No permission was asked." And Mark said, "We thought you would understand." I said, "Understanding does not mean taking." Jenna interjected, "We all help each other." And I said, "Taking without asking is theft." The lawyer spoke about legal consequences, and the tone shifted toward reality. After the revelation, the household splintered. There was crying, accusations, and a hurried attempt at calm. They tried to plead, to explain, to minimize. I could see the clock's hands spinning in their faces. The second moment of tension slowed the room down to a single breath. I remembered my mother's voice and felt the pull between forgiveness and accountability. For 5 minutes, I sat with the decision like a physical weight. I thought of Ethan's quiet text in the dark and knew why he had sent it. The world narrowed to the sound of my own breathing and the faint hum of the refrigerator as neighbors peered in from doorways. The taste of old lemon cake returned as a bitter afterthought in my throat. I then followed through with legal steps. Avery sent a demand letter outlining restitution and the freezing of certain accounts pending investigation. The family lawyer called in a formal meeting and suggested mediation. I agreed to mediation only on the condition that all transactions be transparently audited. Documents were copied, signatures were requested, and I handed over a list of accounts I controlled. The meeting room smelled of waxed wood and disinfectant. I watched faces change as facts replaced plausible deniability. Texts I had preserved were read out loud, and the pattern became undeniable. The private investigator delivered a report detailing dates and amounts, and the accountant I hired reconciled the discrepancies. The third moment of tension came when Mark, pushed to the edge, shouted accusations that were both apology and deflection. He said, "You never trusted me," and I said, "I trusted you with my life, and you—" I placed that trust as an overdraft. I placed a call to Jenna and asked her to consider what family should mean if it required taking from those who sacrificed. I asked Lewis to bear witness if needed. I invited Tom, a longtime family friend, to support mediation as an observer. The room had 8 named people who reacted plainly and differently. The evidence was laid out like a map of betrayal and habit. In quiet moments between accusations, I felt the texture of my sweater and the firmness of the chair beneath me as anchors to the present. Each small sensory detail was a counterpoint to the emotional surge in the room. At approximately 30% into this story and the way I lived it, pause for a moment. If you have felt unseen or taken for granted in a home you love, you know how sharp that loneliness can be. If you think someone should stay and forgive to preserve family harmony, or if someone should expose the truth and regain their dignity, tell me below. Do you think I did right to leave and reveal the transfers, or should I have kept it private for the sake of peace? Type either "I support her" or "I think she should have stayed" and add 1 sentence why. Your words matter because many people watch and do not know how to act. Hearing from you can help others decide whether to seek advice, to secure documents, or to find a lawyer who will listen. Now, let me take you back into the final act where the family must choose an outcome and legal steps move forward. Resolution came in the form of an agreement that felt like a compromise and like justice. Mark agreed to repay certain amounts, and Rachel signed an agreement to restrict access to my accounts. Mediation created a payment plan and a clause that required financial transparency for 1 year. I updated my will and added legal protections that ensured my autonomy. The house rules changed. No access to my bank cards, no assumption of duties without mutual consent, and scheduled visitation that respected my time. I felt the relief of reclaimed space more than the bitterness of betrayal. The lawyer helped me file for an injunction against unauthorized withdrawals and recommended educational sessions about finances for the whole family. I slept for the first time in years without waking to anxiety about what had been taken in the night. I tasted peace as plain bread and found it filling. Epilogo, 1 month later. The house felt quieter. Ethan came over and sat on the porch step, and we spoke about small things. He smelled like school books and rain, and his hands were sticky from a popsicle. He told me he had felt guilty and that the text was his way of helping me leave without a fight. The family had moved their main Sunday gatherings to a community hall and asked if I might attend sometimes. I agreed, but on my terms. My bank account was secure, and I felt lighter. I had a new routine of walking to the corner bakery where the smell of yeast reminded me of mornings when I had energy to bake for family without resentment. I met with Gina for coffee, and we laughed quietly about the absurdity of the situation. Life felt ordinary in a healthy way. Epilogue, 3 months later. Mediation had produced a written plan and restitution was ongoing. Mark had begun therapy and attended financial counseling. Rachel had apologized in a letter that smelled faintly of perfume and tried to explain herself. Some relationships mended tentatively. I continued to see my grandson on scheduled visits where he and I would build puzzles and he would teach me new slang. I watched him grow into accountability, and I watched myself grow into refusal to be minimized. The lawyer filed documents that ensured future access required authorization and a third-party witness. The house sounded different. It was no longer the stage for unchecked demands. I cultivated boundaries like sturdy furniture with legs that would not wobble. Epilogue, 6 months later. The family had adapted to a new equilibrium. Some members withdrew, others stepped forward. There were still awkward Thanksgiving dinners with conversations that grazed around the incident like careful ships avoiding a reef. I had updated my will and set up automatic payments to charities I believed in, a way to direct my legacy beyond family expectations. I found work volunteering at a community center where I taught baking basics. The aroma of cinnamon and sugar became a therapy of its own. Friends I had not seen in years reappeared. I slept through storms. I felt a steadying pride in having protected myself and in having made a difficult decision. The final line is simple and true. For the first time in a long time, I slept without checking my phone at night, and it felt like taking back a house that had always been mine. If you have been through something similar, share it. If you want resources about financial abuse and how to document transactions, check the description and speak to a lawyer. Thank you for listening.